Good evening. Welcome and thanks for coming to the Boston Public Library's Local History Lecture Series. As part of our program, we want to read the following statement to bring attention to the land which we use for our building and events. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the Indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement, which will take place from a spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, Free to All. This talk is being presented in conjunction with the Partnership of Historic Bostons and will be live streamed and recorded and posted on historicbostons.org and their YouTube channel. Questions will be taken at the end of the lecture. Please wait for the microphones to ask questions so that they can be included in the recording. Tonight, we are very pleased to present Undergrounds Before Rail, Escaping Slavery, Claiming Liberty, which will be moderated by LInford Fisher. Lynn received his doctorate from Harvard and is an associate professor of history at Brown University. His research and teaching primarily relate to the cultural and religious history of colonial America and the Atlantic world, including Native Americans, religion, material culture, and Indian and African slavery and servitude. He is the principal investigator of the Stolen Relations Project at Brown, a collaboration with indigenous tribes, which is creating a public database of Native enslavement in the Americas. He is the author of 2 books and numerous articles and chapters, and is currently finishing a history of Native American enslavement in the English colonies and United States, tentatively entitled America Enslaved: The Rise and Fall of Indian Slavery in the English Atlantic and the United States. Lynn, okay.
Good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. Thanks for ending your warm November day in this room here with us. I'm delighted to be a part of this program tonight. As Diane said, my name is LInford Fisher, and I have the privilege of introducing tonight's series program and also the speakers and moderating Q&A and conversation later on. So tonight's event is part of a larger series put on by the Partnership of Historic Bostons, which is a wonderful nonprofit devoted to educating the wider public about Boston, the city, Massachusetts, and also greater New England up through the American Revolution. So this fall, the Historic Bostons is running a series titled Tyranny versus Liberty, 17th Century New England Politics. And in this election year, you might know that it's also happening globally in 76 countries, not just the United States. This series asks us to consider the choices that everyday men and women made and also continue to make regarding political leadership, and what those consequences have been. And I imagine that many of us were thinking about parallel or similar questions on Tuesday, approaching Tuesday, during the day, and afterwards as well, regardless of political affiliation and party. These feel like live questions sometimes in our own lives. And I should say that part of the vision for the series is to highlight the differing perspectives of tyranny and liberty in early America. Not everyone viewed or experienced either tyranny or liberty in the same ways. White colonists, enslaved and free African Americans, enslaved and free indigenous people as well, immigrants, and on and on. One person's liberty could be another person's tyranny, and these meanings are contested throughout this time period, and I would say up into the present in many ways as well. So the lectures in this series highlight these ideas and the definitions that were debated for the entire colonial period in different ways, from the Puritans in the 1630s to enslaved petitions for freedom in the 1770s. So tonight's installment for this series is titled Undergrounds Undergrounds Before Rail, as Diane said, Escaping Slavery, Claiming Liberty, featuring Margaret Newell on the far side there, and Egypt Lloyd, who I will introduce both of them in a minute. We'll first hear a talk by Margaret Newell and followed by a response from Egypt Lloyd, after which we'll have some time for questions, first from me to them and then from the audience, both in person but also online as well. So we'd ask you to hold that until that time. So for the intros. Margaret Newell is the Distinguished Arts and Sciences Professor and Professor of History at The Ohio State University. She's the author of 2 books, From Dependency to Independence, Economic Revolutions in Colonial New England, published in 1998, and Brethren by Nature, New England Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery, published in 2015, which won numerous awards, including the Peter Gomes Memorial Prize from the Massachusetts Historical Society and the James A. Raleigh Prize from the Organization of American Historians. She's also the author of numerous articles, including a fascinating one on pan-Indigenous uprisings in the 17th century in the sort of greater Atlantic world in the William Mary Quarterly last year. You should check it out if you haven't seen it. Her work has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and a host of other institutions. And she's currently working on 3 books, hats off, the most relevant of which is provisionally entitled Undergrounds Before the Age of Rail, Escaping Slavery and Helping Slaves Escape in Colonial America, which is what tonight's talk is drawn from. Egypt Lloyd is co-founder of the Slave Legacy History Coalition, established in 2021, which is a consortium of individuals, institutions, and historical organizations dedicated to the preservation of the history of enslaved people in Cambridge and Boston, Massachusetts. It was founded by the Lloyd family descendants of Tony, Cuba, and Darby, whose enslaver was the wealthy merchant and Harvard donor Isaac Royal Jr., and Egypt Lloyd is one of those descendants. She has served as a project advisor for History Cambridge on the Tory Rose Hidden Black History Project, and in 2022 served as a panelist on the University of Virginia's Legacy of Slavery Conference. Egypt is a woman of many talents, apparently. She's a certified commercial pilot, accredited by the FAA, and is currently pursuing a degree in aeronautics and aerospace engineering from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And prior to her foray into history and aviation, Egypt leveraged her extensive experience in the real estate industry as an accomplished senior government underwriter for more than 20 years. So we're honored to have you both with us tonight, and please join me in welcoming both of them and Margaret to the podium.
Well, thank you for that great introduction, Lynn, and I'm so honored to be sharing a stage with these great historians, and who I'm very much looking forward to their comments later, and hoping to get the conversation started. So if you happen to be in Boston on the High Street, which is now Main Street in Boston, in 1638, you would have seen something kind of surprising if you'd been there at the right time. And you would have seen the escape of 3 captive women from the mansion house of John Winthrop, who was governor of Massachusetts during chunks of the 1630s and early 1640s. Winthrop at one time claimed to own 9 enslaved captive Native Americans, and he listed them in his will, a draft will, in 1639. And at least 5 captives were taken in the Pequot War of 1637, 1638, were living in the Winthrop Mansion House in this period. So the 3 women, we only know their names as Marie, Joan, and Jane, were actually assisted by 2 other captives then living in the Winthrop household. One's name was Tenskwatawa. He was from Block Island. He had been captured in the Pequot War, not a Pequot, but just visiting relatives, as many of these different Native American groups in New England were related by kinship. So often people had multiple kind of ethnic identities, tribal allegiances, and had lots of kinfolk in the area that they used to travel and visit. So Tenskwatawa, who John Winthrop renamed Reprieve, just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time as the war broke out. Another was a man named, that John Winthrop called Robin, but his indigenous name was Cassasinnamon. He was related to leadership lineages among the Massachusetts people, but also leadership lineages among the Pequot people. So 2 Pequots helped 3 other Indigenous women escape in 1638. And it turns out they were among many captives taken in the Pequot War who tried to escape almost immediately after their capture in 1637, 1638, 1639. So these 5, this little group of 5, or the 3 women, joined at least 10 other captives who passed through the territory of the Narragansett Sachem Miantonomo during this period. And they were amongst the first that appear in this historical record, but they were far from the last that appear in the historical records of 17th and 18th century New England. So when we think about escaping from slavery, I think many of us have images of the Underground Railroad and of the 19th century accounts that we might be more familiar with. But we know much more about the escapees of the 19th century. I mean, they were much larger in number. They also, many of them wrote autobiographies, or there were biographies. They gave interviews in newspapers. So there was a robust print medium out there that could spread their stories. We know about people who participated in the Underground Railroad because people in the 19th century and the 20th century did research on them and were actually able to interview the living participants in the Underground Railroad, both people who escaped and the African American and white conductors who helped their escape. Even as late as the Depression era, when the US government funded social workers, sociologists, scholars to go out and interview the remaining living people who had experienced enslavement, and they also got information about these things from them. And we know from these stories that many people used, they traveled on stagecoaches, they traveled on steamships, they traveled on trains. I mean, they used mass transit of the time to find freedom. Sometimes they traveled over land, but they had to cross water, they had to go through towns. I mean, there were routes, there were transportation networks, there were communication networks that both made their task more difficult because word could be spread about runaways, but also were ways for them to be connected to much larger communities and to know more about the communities and the places where they were going. The 19th century is also an era in which people at least had a sense that there were such things as free soil, although the research that many scholars have been doing has really been undermining the notion of the North as free soil before the Civil War. But we have ideas in our head of what's free soil. So in thinking about the 17th and early 18th century, I thought, how do we write about the lives of escapees when we don't have these newspaper ads? Right? So there are almost no newspapers in early America before 1760. Boston's the exception. It briefly has a newspaper in the 1690s, in the 1720s very briefly, and then more robust in the mid 18th century. But most of the other colonial societies are only developing them in the 1760s. There are very few autobiographies of people who talk about their experiences in slavery until the latter part of the 18th century. So we don't have the same sorts of records to talk about the experiences of freedom seekers in the early period. So their experiences can be pulled out through correspondence, as people like John Winthrop tried to track down the escapees. They appear in journals, they appear in legislation, and they appear in court records as freedom seekers who are caught are then tried, and juries have to decide the justice of their claims of freedom. So these are the sorts of records that I drew on to find some of these stories that I'm sharing with you, like the stories of Jane, Joan, and Marie. So this charter generation of enslavement in New England was mostly Native American. So there are enslaved Africans in New England in the 1620s and 1630s, but the Pequot War brings hundreds of captives and into Boston and Connecticut and nearby towns, and also brings ushers in an era in which the enslavement of Indians is both a cause and an effect of almost all of the wars and conflicts that you might be familiar with, like King Philip's War in 1675, 1676, and the almost 70 years of warfare that New England engaged in with the Wabanaki Confederacy to the north. So, all of these events involved the capture and enslaving of Native Americans. The English colonists, including many people from New England, were also involved in in Native American warfare, enslaving in the Southeast, where about somewhere between 60 and 80,000 Native Americans were enslaved in the Carolinas and in La Florida, so the sort of greater Southeast. And some of those people actually end up in New England as well. So there's extensive enslavement of Native Americans by the English colonists in the Eastern Seaboard in the 17th and 18th century. So some of the, many of the stories I find in the 17th century are about Native Americans. So one thing one pattern I see, if we want to think about what makes for a sort of successful escape, what's often behind escape, and what sort of explains why people go and where they go, is that kinship ends up being a very important variable in where people are choosing to go, how they're defining what free soil is, and you know, it enhances their chances of making a successful escape. The 3 women in Winthrop's household were aided to escape in a plan that involved Native Americans from across the region. It wasn't just Reprieve and Robin. It was, in fact, a plan that pulled in a Native American leader named Uncas, who established the Mohegan tribal nation in the wake of the Pequot War. He actually allied himself with the English. He himself was related to Pequot leadership, had been sort of upset about being passed over for a leadership position, had allied himself with the English, and was interested in increasing his numbers and in taking, you know, sort of taking charge of Pequots who survived the war and who escaped enslavement amongst the English, and to have them be part of his new tribal nation, essentially. So what he was looking for were subjects, were people, you know, so population to be tributary to him, but to be part of his society, not necessarily enslaving them in the way that the English were doing. So the 3 women that were targeted for aid in freedom were daughters of a high-status female sachem, Sunksqua, from Long Island. She was either Shinnecock or Montaukett. And so many leaders in southern New England, Native American leaders, were actually really interested in these women. So the sachem of the Narragansetts was interested in them as well. A lot of people wanted to marry them because marriage would connect them through kinship to many other, to not only to the Shinnecock and the Montaukett, but to other Pequot refugees in the region. And everybody's sort of interested in building population, increasing population in these various indigenous communities. So there's actually competition over these women. The other interesting thing that is associated with this case is that neither Reprieve, Tenskwataten, or Robin Casa-Cinnamon end up really suffering any bad consequences from these actions. So it's sort of known that they help the women escape and help lead them to freedom. And yet, you know, John Winthrop really kind of shrugs his shoulders. He tries to get the women back, tries very hard, but he doesn't really seem to have punished the 2 men. Reprieve actually had some knowledge of the path and actually picked the route that the 3 women took, because he had actually absented himself from the Winthrop household for a very long period of time the year before. So he started out on a mission that Winthrop had sent him on. Many men, male captives, were sent as guides or to carry communications between colonial outposts. But Reprieve had basically treated that as the opening for carrying a lot of business that he wanted to carry on with. He met with different relatives. He actually tracked down the movements of many Pequots who had not been captured, but he didn't always share that information with Winthrop. He shared it with other indigenous leaders and his father, who was in leadership on Block Island, as you know, and as people thought about ways to, you know, to provide refuge for these Pequots in Indian country rather than as captives of the English. He visited girlfriends. You know, he moved around through the countryside and covered large swaths of territory. But he was spotted in Narragansett. The sachem of the Narragansetts told the English that I saw Reprieve, I saw Tenskwataten there. He got picked up, sent back to the Winthrop household. So this time he told Joan, Marie, and Jane, we're not going to go through Narragansett country. We're not going to take the direct route. We're going to kind of go around through Nipmuc country, kind of make our way back into this territory. And 2 of the women appeared to have stayed with Uncas, married Uncas, and Reprieve ended up marrying one of the women. Reprieve would become a leader in Block Island, succeeding his father, taking on the name Jacquantu, and becoming a sachem in the middle of the 17th century. So this is a sort of successful escape, and there's lots of and Reprieve's own actions show a kind of different mode of something we should include in our definitions of freedom-seeking escape. Somebody who just sort of does a more short-term absence, someone who leaves captivity, but is caught or is returned, but doesn't seem to suffer tremendous consequences for that. Someone who creates space to engage in other business, visit kin, do things that person wanted to do, exercises mobility, exercises agency. So we see these things happening within the context of Indigenous enslavement in New England too. But there are other captives that did not have these sorts of endings, where they managed to escape escape slavery, escape captivity, and return to homelands, or at least places adjacent to homelands, and to form or protect kinship bonds. So of the other captives that were traveling to the Narragansett country in 1637 and 1638, we know specifically about 6 of them. And 3 of them were a woman from Winnisemmet, a woman who was in the household of William Blackstone, who was an Anglican minister who preceded the Puritans in Boston, and a young girl who was held as a captive, who was held by an innkeeper named Mr. Coles, who lived across the street from John Winthrop's mansion house. So these people might have all interacted in 1637, who were captives in these various places in Boston. So these women suffered a very different fate than Joan, Marie, and Jane. They were not high status. They had kinship ties, which drew them to run away to the same sort of region and try to return and meet their families again, but they did not succeed. So the English put tremendous pressure on the Narragansett to return these captives, and the Narragansett did not do so in the case of the high status daughters of the Sunk Squaw, but they did do so in the case of these 3 young women. All of them were burned with a hot brand to mark them as runaways. The young women who had been in the Coles household had already been raped, punished for the rape by public branding, public punishment in Boston by the town beadle. And she told Roger Williams this, and he still returned her to the Coles household. The woman who had escaped from Blackstone's household had done so before. This was her second escape. And a 19th century history of Blackstone, biography of Blackstone, argued that the tradition was that Blackstone had actually relocated to the Rhode Island, Connecticut, what is now the Rhode Island, Connecticut border, the territory this woman wanted to go to. She might have been related to the Niantic. And the Blackstone Valley takes his name because of his location to that area, and that he followed her, that basically to keep her in the household, he went where she wanted him to go and moved his entire household. Now, there are other reasons why Blackstone might have made that choice, but this is another sort of thing we can think about, as even people who are are experiencing captivity, who remain in captivity, could still find ways to better influence or at least maintain some of their ties with kin, even as they remained in servitude. And this image, there's some contestation about who it is, but one historian of art at RISD Museum believes this is a portrait of Cassasinim and Robin, so one of the people that helped the young girls escape out of Winthrop's house, and who became a leader of a revived Mashantucket Pequot settlement in the 1640s and 1650s. So the next story I wanted to tell you about was about a girl who was captured during the Pequot War as well. She was not a Pequot. So the Pequots were fleeing the slaving that the English were doing during the Pequot War, especially targeting women and children towards the end of the war. The sort of fleeing Pequot actually went to what they hoped was free soil. They went to visit relatives and shelter with relatives in western and central Connecticut. And it's there that the English picked up one of the largest groups of captives. There were at least 100 captive women and children taken near Fairfield, Connecticut. And 19 of these people were actually sent to an island off the coast of Venezuela. So they were exported into the Atlantic slave trade, into the Caribbean. And it looks like one of these people, a young girl who had a severe wound, was ended up in the possession of a slaveholder named Captain Morris. So she was basically his plunder from being involved in this. So Morris writes in 1647, though, so this is almost 10 years after the war, so 9 years after this girl was captured, that he had lost his Indian. He's lately lost his Indian. He's lost his Indian maidservant, and as we suppose, she has come into your liberties. So she's fled to Connecticut. And that use of the word liberties is an interesting way to describe 17th century Connecticut for Native Americans, because it was far from a place that involved liberty. But in other words, she self-freed herself by the enticement of her father and her uncle. So Morris went on to say how well he and his wife had treated this girl, that they had healed her wounds, treated her like their own child, and that they had actually entertained her relatives. So she had living relatives who had not been taken captive, and they would come and visit her in the Morris household off and on, all during her captivity. And her relatives, this was a high-status woman as well. Her relatives were in leadership of the Wangunk Native American group, so in Western Connecticut and Hartford area. She was tied to these two lineages. So at different times, Morris actually tried to ransom the girl to them, and so basically wanted them to pay him a large amount of wampum, which was a currency at this time, to buy a substitute, to buy an enslaved African to replace her. So this is the offer he had made to the family. He said, I even offered to let her get married. Keep in mind that servitude in this period meant you didn't actually have the freedom to marry. Instead, she ran away. So with the help of her uncle and of her other relatives, she actually escaped the Morris household. So Morris was asking authorities in Connecticut and Massachusetts to buy him an enslaved African to take her place. Now these are people who are escaping and traveling within New England, still traveling anywhere from approximately 50 miles as the crow flies to 140 miles as the crow flies. And we have to think about, they're not crows, right? So they're traversing territory, and they might be familiar with that territory, but especially these young women are not necessarily used to traveling by themselves. They're still having to feed themselves over weeks and weeks of travel. They're footsore, even in the summer or early fall, they're experiencing, a lot of stress and duress. And Mantanomo claimed that some of these female captives who escaped actually died of exposure, that they died in the woods. We don't know, he might have just been sort of keeping them, sort of saying they were dead in order to not return them to the English, but it's also plausible that they did experience this difficult, these are difficult journeys and these are large distances. But we also know that in 1648, a woman actually managed to escape from Bermuda and return to New England. She stowed away on a ship owned by Samuel Scarlett. And Scarlett brought her, these are tiny ships, people could not stay hidden. She was probably discovered almost immediately if she wasn't smuggled on by somebody who knew and helped her get on. But when Scarlett arrived, he claims he handed her over to the local magistrates, but she managed to escape again in New England. This makes me think she might actually have been a New England Native American. That second escape in particular, we can say she might have just gotten on a random ship in Bermuda, but in this case, she managed to escape again, which suggests that there was, a community to go to, some knowledge, some local knowledge, some place to, some reason for her success in this, both the first and the second escape. So we can also see that there are people who return to homeland over great distances, Atlantic distances, from Bermuda to New England, but also as some of these captives from the Southeast who start being incorporated, or start being trafficked from Savannah and Charlestown and Carolinas up into Boston, that some people who are enslaved from those regions actually attempt to escape by water. So there are several incidents between 1701 and 1711 in which these so-called Spanish and Carolina Indians steal ships. And sometimes they do this with African Americans and attempt to sail back to La Florida. And at least one ship, so a group that actually steals a sloop. This is a group of 13 Native Americans and Africans steal a sloop in Sandy Hook off the coast of New Jersey, close to New York City. And even though a privateer chased them, they managed to evade this privateer, and they were headed for St. Augustine, Florida, which was free soil for them. But we also know that sometimes people ran away not to a place, but just to escape, a kind of intolerable situation. And this was the case with a young girl named Moll. It's like an intolerable incident happened, and she just walked. She just left without a plan, without people to help her, not really knowing how to get to her family. Her family lived on the island of Nantucket. So she was in Aquinawampanoag. And she had been trafficked from Nantucket by one of the proprietors of Nantucket to a man named John Bishop in the Salem-Ipswich area. And she ran away from Bishop in 1660, and a Native American encountered her, and he brought her to the magistrate. And it's unclear to me whether the Native American was sort of on Moll's side or not on Moll's side, but he did not at least hand her over to Bishop, to her master. But this also suggests that, when we think about escapees in the 19th century, going to urban places, where there are always sort of large communities of color in which they can lose themselves, where there are people who are both freed and enslaved in the South and people who are free communities of color in the North, in which people could blend and be, part of. It was a lot more challenging for these escapees in the 17th and 18th century. Especially if they were wearing English clothes that marked them as somebody in an English household, a servant. That might get you kind of noticed that get you noticed in the 17th century if you were just walking down a lane. If you're a young person walking alone, someone just might come up and ask you questions about who you were and where you were going. Moll also had to think about how was she going to get home, because she was going to have to cross water to do so. So at this point she was just probably trying to get away from Bishop, who the records around this case suggest there's some sexual assaults involved in Moll's treatment. So I deduce this in part because of the reaction of the magistrates to whom she's brought by this Native American whose nickname was Harry. So Bishop hears that this girl's been picked up, and he comes and gets her, and the magistrates won't turn her over. And in fact, a brawl erupts that involves all of a bunch of people in town. Like, should we get into a giant brawl? Which suggests that Bishop had really been doing something, because usually people in power in New England supported the rights of slaveholders and masters in any dispute with Native Americans, Africans, servants, slaves. And in this case, the magistrates really resisted turning her over to Bishop again. And in the end, they did turn her. In the end, the court returned her to this abusive household that had, kidnapped her basically, and other things were going on. But this case also shows that one of the things that running away triggered a conflict within the slaveholder society. It triggered discussions about the morality of what they were doing. The magistrate in this case was named John Haythorne. John and William, two brothers, and they're actually descendants of Nathaniel Hawthorne, ancestors of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Hawthorne, talked about this case, and he said, I would not like to see a daughter of mine in this sort of situation. I mean, he actually identified with the parents and with this child as a human being, and it made him question the whole situation. So this is one thing that people who ran away did. They created crises within the communities that were really who kept slavery going. And there's not a giant police force. There's not a giant army. There's not this giant law enforcement presence in colonial New England. Who made slavery happen? Who made it persist? Were your neighbors. The members of the community were what made it possible. It took a village to make slavery exist and persist, and to protect the power and enforce the power of claimants of other people's lives and labor. And the people who ran away, broke that facade for some. And there are other cases in the 17th and 18th century where similar things happen. So the opposite of liberty would be a slave code. And in 1641, Massachusetts defined slavery. And the first legal code published in the English colonies, there was a code of slavery inserted into it. It particularly targeted people who were captured in just wars. So, basically, it's creating a legal framework for the enslavement of the Pequots that were already in their households. It also, though, said you could enslave, the state could enslave people. The state could actually say you are enslavable and therefore you are enslaved. And then people who were brought to us and sold to us, so people who are enslaved by a third party and brought and sold as slaves already, also an enslavable category. So those were the three enslavable categories in this statute. And this statute was the basic of the law of slavery for all of the New England colonies without much alteration. I contest this with other historians, but there's no statute that ever says that slavery is inheritable in New England. The way Virginia, Barbados, other places write a legal code in which the status of the child follows the status of the mother, in which slavery can be perpetual. That is never confirmed in statute in New England for Native Americans, and therefore it doesn't actually become confirmed in statute for Africans either. In practice, people always try to keep the children. They always try to keep people for life and keep their children after them. But they don't have a legal position. They have a position of custom, and they point to the law elsewhere. But this is a very bare bones slave code. But the other thing we can see happening in the 1740s is the creation of a kind of fugitive slave law, body of law and practice, particularly in Connecticut, but also in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So the countries or the colonies who had participated in the Pequot War, in the treaty that resolved it, actually included a fugitive slave clause in which their former allies, the indigenous allies who had helped the English in this war, were enjoined not to protect captives and not to protect runaways, or they themselves could be enslaved. In its first legal code of 1850, the longest section of this code in Connecticut is about Native Americans, and much of it is devoted to all the powers that the English have to take Native Americans who have injured them in some way, trespass, theft, things that were in the eye of the beholder often, and take them, seize them, and sell them into slavery or convert them into slaves. Connecticut also then repeated this Fugitive Slave Act and enjoined, allowed slaveholders pursuing runaways to take people's boats, to take their horses, like to seize public transportation or other private means and use it to run down their runaways. So, this is an environment that's already been created in the 1640s and 1650s. It's targeting Native Americans, but we can talk about the general environment that's creating for the very large, dominant, free indigenous population, which, is facing enslavement for a variety of what might be, in fact, their view that the English were trespassing on their land could turn into a situation in which they might find themselves in a law enforcement situation. They were being threatened with enslavement. And Native American groups are all talking about this. In 1645, the English really threatened war against the Narragansetts, a former ally. And the resolution of this quasi-war is, again, a heightened fugitive slave law agreement with the Narragansetts, the forcing of them to put children as hostages, threats of enslavement, large, sort of bounties and fees and so on. So this sort of, do not protect fugitives becomes really part of the law of the land and a practice. And by the late 17th century, all of the New England colonies start adapting the elements of the law of slavery as practiced in other English colonies and other European colonies at this moment. So they don't resolve the heritability issue, but they do pass laws about preventing people from gathering, restricting the mobility of Native American and African servants and slaves. So these laws don't apply to white servants. They only apply to servants of color. So these are explicitly racialized laws that are only applying to Native Americans and African Americans. But they also pass laws in the wake of really before King Philip's War and after King Philip's War, that affect the free population of indigenous people, and requiring them often to wear badges when they, or some sort of indicator of their status when they pass through English towns, keeping them out of English towns, not allowing them to go to English markets, for example, or things like that, which they had done. And imposing pass laws, like requirements for freedom passes. Like what, they're not even manumission papers because these people haven't been manumitted who are having to carry them, but they are passes that they're going to have to carry in order to prove their freedom. So badges to prove their loyalty, passes to prove their freedom. So these are systems that we don't really associate as much with the 17th century, but they're actually happening in the 17th century. So in Connecticut, the indigenous people were regarded in law as slaves for now, slaves pro tempore, not slaves forever. But ending a period of servitude, ending a period of legal slavery, which is what many people, refugees, women and children, non-combatants from King Philip's War, were sentenced to long periods of servitude that practically signified slavery for many of them. But the Connecticut was very clear, no, these people are not slaves forever, right? They're slaves for now. And there's idea there should be a period of freedom after that. But in reality, there was no pathway for freedom, for equality, for equal liberties with the English, for sharing the same sort of rights and privileges that English had. So there were restrictions on what their status would be, what towns they could stay in and live in. Would they be even allowed to stay in a town where they had served as a forced, involuntary servant for 15, 20 years? Would they even be allowed to stay in that town after that term of service? It was a little bit unclear. And throughout the 17th and 18th century, the warning out system, which some of you might be familiar with, in which towns basically kicked poor people out, or people they thought would be a financial burden on the town, were taken to the edge of town, told to get out. They would kick out people of color too. I mean, a significant proportion of the people they were kicking out of town were Africans and Native Americans. So the exception are some towns in Rhode Island that would actually recognize the town rights of people that were associated ethnically with the lands in Narragansett or had some tie to the Narragansett reserves. So in the we talked a moment ago about, I mentioned Reprieve and his sort of walkabout they did as he just sort of wandered the countryside before returning to the Winthrop home the first time. I wanted to sort of talk about the different ways that people could engage in kind of short-term negotiation for some space within slavery, what historians might call sanctuary from slavery. So we know from oral histories and from some 18th and 19th century histories that places that, you see a map of New England, there are these cedar swamps still that remain. Some of them are actually in Native American reserves, the Mashpee Reserve, the Narragansett Reserve, the Niantic Reserve, the Pequot Reserve. They almost always include a place that's like a swamp on the map. But we know that near Thoreau's Woods, Framingham, other places were actually sites of marronage. Marronage is when enslaved people run away and live for long or short periods of time, and their slaveholders can't really get them back. Right? So these are literally spaces for respites from slavery that might last for a short time or a long time, and that these places in New England fulfilled that same sort of position. We know that people negotiated the right to go visit relatives. In the case of a man named Tom, who negotiated, a captive from King Philip's War, who negotiated the right to go visit his wife. Again, servants weren't supposed to marry. They're not allowed to marry without their master's permission. And servitude was really meant to be a stage of life. It was like a teenager thing or a young, a child to adulthood thing for English colonists. So for these Native Americans who are in involuntary servitude, they're captives or they're enslaved, they are not they're being prevented from visiting their wives and families. These are people that had families. So we see people, truly demanding that these things happen. So we're running a little short on time, I know, and I wanted to maybe talk about one more case, and then I'll turn it over to Egypt, and we'll start our general discussion. So if we move into the 18th century, now we have a kind of changed world. We have a world in New England in which there are newspapers with runaway ads and ads for the sale of enslaved people. So about 266 ads involving the sale of Native Americans or Native Americans running away appear in New England newspapers in the 18th century. There are also new ways to travel. There's a post road. There's more regular ships and water travel, more boats to steal. As a child whose master had enslaved him, maybe also another New England Indian from Bermuda who took the opportunity when his master visited Newport to steal a boat and run away. And there were ferries. And ferries turned out to be a big pinch point for runaways because particularly the ferry keepers of New London, which was an important ferry route, were very sticky about checking people's passes, these passes that had started to be required in the 17th century. And I was looking at a file in Rhode Island Judicial Record Center, and I came across a case involving a man named Isaac. And he's variously referred to as Isaac Mulatto, Isaac Anthony, because at one time he had been either a slave or a servant of Albro Anthony in Newport. But one of the documents refers to him as Isaac Villavera, which is interesting. So we could talk a little bit about where that might have come from. So these two pieces of paper are examples of passes, the kind of passes that people of color were supposed to carry to prove their freedom. They're kind of freedom paper for the 18th century, early 18th century, but they're forgeries. And they were forged by Isaac Anthony Villavera. And in the case against Isaac, the people who were beneficiaries of the forgery actually, testified against him and identified him as the forger in one case. So things are looking pretty bad for Isaac. And then another piece of evidence is entered, which is the guy had a handwriting book. He had a book on how to write different kinds of documents and how to mimic certain kinds of handwriting. And he sometimes actually forged bills of credit, kind of IOUs that were kind of formal and informal currency in New England. So, he has a forger's handbook basically in his possession. So this is entered into evidence. So things look terrible for Isaac, that he's going to, be enslaved himself. That is the penalty that's being hanging over his head. But he manages to beat the rap. He actually, the court does not find him guilty or not guilty. It chooses this undecided kind of thing, and he is freed. He has to pay some fines, but he is freed. And what I love about this is that there's a note in his file where he's practicing handwriting, and this is the title piece of his orthography book, but on the back of it he's practicing different sorts of things. And at one point he writes out, "Fortune is very unconstant." Isn't fate crazy? Well, in this case, Isaac managed to help people escape from slavery. He managed to avoid enslavement himself and managed to move through a legal system that in general had been very hostile. So if we have time in the Q&A later, I might try to come back to this case, which is 3 generations of freedom seekers in Hartford and Connecticut who have amazing cases. 2 of them actually get reparations from their former enslavers. And what I'd say about these cases is not only do they create a lot of, they create that kind of cognitive dissonance for the English colonists. These are cases that in which juries side with the escapees, which you do not see very much in the 17th century, and in which the authorities at the at their colonial legislatures actually have to debate slavery, actually have to talk about the inheritability question, actually have to talk about, can we treat Native American enslaved people differently than we treat African enslaved Africans? It causes tons of conflict within these political systems as they discuss these issues of liberty. So I'll stop here, and we can come back and talk about some of the nitty-gritty, but thank you very much, and we'll wait to hear from Egypt.
Good evening, everyone. How are you doing today? It's a pleasure to be here as a guest with a partnership of Historic Boston. I want to say a special thank you to President Sid and also to our distinguished panelists, Margaret, and congratulations on your book, and also Lynn. As Lynn mentioned, my name is Egypt Lloyd, and along with the Lloyd family, we have founded the Slave Legacy History Coalition in 2021. The Lloyd family are descendants of Tony, Cuba, and their 6 grandchildren, including Cyrus and Darby, who were all enslaved by Isaac Royal Jr., family who endowed the first law professorship in 1781 at Harvard University, which eventually became Harvard Law School. The royal family, as well as the vassal family, were sugar plantation owners in Antigua and Jamaica. The Slave Legacy History Coalition offers several programs connected to the history and legacy of enslavement, including a virtual platform which provides historical institutions and universities, enslaved descendants, and individuals with a connection to legacy and the history of enslaved history to share the information and story. Now, I will take a moment to say that there is no question that any discussion concerning the legacy of slavery can be complex, confusing, and definitely controversial. Clearly, our conversation is no exception. To my best knowledge, my grand-descendants, Cuba and Tony, did not arrive in the Boston and Cambridge, Medford area communities via the Underground Railroad. They were brought to New England as enslaved persons by the royal and vassal family. However, my grand-descendants, particularly Darby and Cyrus, were very active in the abolition movement. Now, I would like to pause for a moment briefly just to highlight their efforts. Now, Darby and Cyrus, as they had found their freedom, and I will mention that Darby Vassal was born into slavery in 1769. After his freedom in 1796, Darby and his brother Cyrus were founding members of the African Society, a mutual aid organization for free Black citizens in Massachusetts. And in 1835, Darby and Cyrus Vassal founded the Abel Smith School for African American Children on Beacon Hill, the present-day site of Museum of African American History. And if you don't know that, Darby Vassal is buried in Undercroft at Christ Church with the White Vassal family. I remember as a young girl walking past Christ Church that is located in Cambridge Square with my father, not knowing that my grand-descendant was buried in that Undercroft. It is very important for you, as for all of us, to understand our history. There is one quote that sticks to me as I have learned my history from a Spanish-born American philosopher. You may know him as George Santayana. He was born between 1863 to 1952, and he is quoted to saying, "To know your future, you must know your past." Some several years later, Dr. Carl Saga has also, as a noted author and science communicator, is also saying the same point, but slightly different. You have to know your past to understand your future. So I say that to bring a notice and highlight the Slave Legacy History Coalition and how that came about. As my descendants came here, as they were stripped away from their homeland, they had to rebuild their lives here with unimaginable strength. So that information cannot be taken lightly. And so what we did is that we have formed the Enslaved Legacy History Coalition in 2021. We have been honored by several great presenters since our founding in 2021. Now, our first presenter here, you may have known her, Dr. Carrie Greenidge. She is doing some wonderful work at Tufts University. She was our very, very first presenter. I will say that as I show you our library, because I would like to share our knowledge with you as well, to you here today. All of our information can be found at our Slave Legacy History Coalition YouTube channel. So as you go on your journey, this may be helpful to you as I tell you some of our past presenters, and also there's more information on our website, which is www.slavelegacyhistorycoalition.org. Our second presenter was Richard Taylor. He has done several amazing things as well. He also received a degree from Harvard Law School. We have Dr. Robert Bellinger. He was our third presenter. And Christopher Began. Christopher Began has been a very strong asset to the Slave Legacy History Coalition. He currently is running the Longfellow House, where my family was enslaved at, and a great supporter and a great friend. That was me and my father. We spoke virtually. This is telling our history of our family, which is also found on the Boston Public Library YouTube channel and on our as well. We had my good friend, Dr. Christine Hutcherson Jones. She ran the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery. She was the runner there for a portion of time, and now she have a promotion, and she's currently with Brown University. We have Marieke Van Dam. Now, let me just say a moment about Marieke Van Dam. She is currently the director of History Cambridge, and a good friend and a great supporter of the Slave Legacy History Coalition. We wouldn't be where we are today without the support and love for Marieke Van Dam in History Cambridge. Our fifth presenter was Pan Conclave, and she has a great organization called Black Coral, and I was fortunate enough to be on that project with her as well. Charles Sullivan, Commissioner of Cambridge Historical Commission, he honored us with his presentation on the landscapes of things in the Cambridge Historical Commission. Lauren Goshlick, now this home right here was the home of Henry and Penelope Vassell, of course, who was an enslaver of my descendants. And that is Lauren Vassell, the house, and actually in that young little girl there is my daughter Leah, and that's Dr. Christine Hutcherson Jones. We was given a tour. She was open enough to give the public a tour of her home for us. We do have a presentation that we was lucky to be on NPR, WBUR radio, which tells our story. So if you'd like to recap that, that is available too as well. Back in June of 2022, we presented with Cambridge Black History Project at the Old Burying Ground with several of my family members laying flowers of the unmarked slave names of people that are unknown that are buried at the Old Burying Ground. Paula Paris, who has been an asset to us, and she runs the Cambridge Black Historic Project, and a good friend, and she has presented as well. And so included with the Cambridge Black History Project was Frank Lucas and Sandra Harrington as well. And also, like Lynn mentioned, I was honored to be at the UVA on a panel with Harvard University on the Legacy of Slavery Conference. Nicole Pipenbrink, a very, very good friend of mine. Nicole did a documentary which can be found on HereLiesDarbyVassell.art, And she is a recent graduate of Harvard School of Design graduate, and she did a documentary on the burial ground of my grand descendant, Darby Vassell. He was buried in the Undercroft at Christ Church in Cambridge. And Barry Gaither, he presented to as well, and he is with the National Center of African American Artists. Dr. Alexandra Russell, she presented the Harvard and Legacy tour for us in December. Arthur Nick Tabor, he wrote a book called Africatown. It was surrounding the last slave ship that landed in Africatown called the Catilda. He was a presenter for us. He shared his experience in writing the book and his challenges as a white person doing history on African American enslavement. So Nick Tabor. Melvin B. Miller. Now, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with Melvin B. Miller. He founded the Bay State Banner, the oldest Black African American newspaper that's still running today here locally in Boston. Peter Drumming and Gavin Gillespie, which you'll see here next, they run the Massachusetts Historical Society. They presented at the Slave Legacy History Coalition, and also we had the opportunity to present at the Massachusetts Historical Society as well. And that's both of them there, Peter Drumming and Gavin. Brooke Newman, lovely woman, author. She's affiliated with Virginia Commonwealth, and she wrote a book on the history of the UK and the royal family and their retirement to enslavement. And she's wrote a book on that, and I highly suggest that book as well. We've had director Jonathan Knight, and he did a documentary based out of Kentucky in the enslavement that was held in Kentucky. And if you would like to see that documentary, it was called Invented Before You Were Born. Aja Lane, she's doing some great things. She is an archaeologist, and she's working on the enslaved bones that were found at that are held at the Harvard Peabody Museum. And she's doing some fabulous work. And like I said, all these presenters you can go back and recap and view all of their presentations on our Slave Legacy History Coalition YouTube channel. Kiara Singleton. Now, I don't know if you ever had the chance to go to Medford. There is a royal house and slave quarters where my family was enslaved at. She is currently director over that as well. Sarah Blythe, she is currently the Vice Provost of Special Projects at Harvard University and Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and she honored us with her presence to give an update to the community with the steps on what's going on with the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery initiative. And Dr. Christian Walks, he was the former director of the Museum of African American History, and he was there to present us to as well with the history that there would lie within the Museum of African American History. Rachel Hoy, she is an associate that works at the Shirley Eustace House. If you have not been there, I highly suggest you take a visit there. And Catherine Matthews, she is currently running the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated Church. And we also was honored to become affiliated with the 10 Million Names, 10 Million Names. And we had Kendra Fields, Dr. Vincent Brown, and of course, Carrie Greenwich to present. Our family had an exhibition at American Folk Art Museum by curator Emily Gavant, and there's an audio video of our family and pictures of our history and our tie-in to Harvard Law School, and that's Emily right there. Now, this is a very, very special picture to me. And that's Julia Royal, and that's my father. That was the first day that we met each other, and that was a very emotional day because Julia Royal, who's a good friend, we call each other our cousins, she is the descendant of the enslaver who enslaved our family. Who would have thought that a descendant of the slave and enslaver would become a family? And we talk almost every day. And that we spoke at the Harvard Club of New York, and this picture was taken at Harvard Memorial Church. And this is us when we was at the Harvard Club of New York. The lady, young lady to the left at the bottom, the first lady is Carissa Chin. She was an undergraduate at Harvard University, who is a Rhodes Scholar now in London. She's the one that brought this information to our family. So this picture right here is very important because we have the descendants of the enslaved and enslavers together as one. So forgiveness is never too late to forgive. And also Joseph Bagley, who is City of Archaeologist here and Director of the City of Boston. And again, we had Catherine and Peter Drummy of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Paula Bagger, who was the president of the Higham Historical Society. Mimi Pitchy, and who is affiliated with the Hidden Jamaican Plan. She was there to give us a great presentation back in June. Recently, we had a Dr. Sheila Viola. She's a researcher at the University of Virginia. Our next presenter is going to be Dr. Richard Cellini, who ran who's part of the Harvard and Legacy Memorial Initiative, and he will be presenting to us next month. So, with all that being said, I would like to take a moment and ask you a question for you to ponder on. What are you doing to preserve your legacy for your family and for the future? That's a very important question that I think that everyone should answer. And it doesn't have to be tied to enslavement. It could be just tied from, if even you're from a different country, Italy or anything. But just know that your legacy and what you're leaving is very, very important because it will impact the future. And with that, I am very looking forward to questions and answers from you all.
All right, well, thank you so much to Margaret and to Egypt for these thought-provoking conversations and presentations. We want to shift just for a few minutes to a little bit of a moderated discussion, and then we'll open up for the audience Q&A. So be thinking about what you want to ask. We'll have some mic runners around as well. I was really struck in a way by listening to both your presentations, both of which were excellent and thought-provoking, and thinking about the two different ways of coming at this history in a way, right? One is intensely archival. Margaret, I don't know of anyone else who knows these archives better than you do in the region here in terms of the history of indigenous enslavement and so forth. And the stories you can tell from that. And I think Egypt, sort of the work that you're doing and the people that you are showing to us, and the amazing, incredible work they're doing in the present, looking both in archaeology, some archival work as well, but also reconstructing family histories and so forth from another angle entirely, from the present backwards. And I was struck by that, but I wanted to sort of hear just very briefly, each of you kind of reflect on that kind of difference in methodology and how we as the public and the audience here and online might think about the power of and the role of both the archive and family stories and oral histories, both from the past and the present, in trying to get a fuller picture of the past, if that makes sense. So I don't know who wants to jump in first.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. I know for me, it's very important, digging up and researching our family history and knowing the like imaginal strength they had to do to build a legacy. You know, we can't take that lightly. You know, as a descendant and our ancestors coming here, they struggled. So what do we do with that information? You know, we have to preserve that. And we also, it makes you recognize the importance of leaving a legacy for your children or for yourself. What would you like for someone to remember of you? And it's important to preserve not only the past as we find it, but the present as well.
No, I think it was a great question, and I loved your response, Egypt. I guess I would say I think that all of us are working in archives because I think descendant communities have archives. They have great genealogy. They have information that we don't have. So often in my stories, I don't know what happened to people after they passed through the court case or the journal or the letter. I don't know what happened afterwards. Some people I know, some people I don't. The descendant communities know, and you know it helps. So I think one of the things that's happened in the last 10 years is that historians have realized the amazing archives that Indigenous communities hold and that descendant communities hold, and that how rich they are and how they can change, you know how they've attitude changed, given us things to investigate. I don't know about you, but one of the hard parts about writing about slavery, Indigenous slavery, all these things is that, you know, it doesn't have a clear endpoint in some ways. That and slavery morphs and finds different forms, even after the 13th Amendment. So, you know, I think that the descendant communities, you know, provide a way, as you say, coming back from the present to the past, starting the past, moving forward, to kind of understand this long arc, and that these histories that I'm telling about the 17th and early 18th century, you know, have echoes and counterparts in the 19th and 20th too, in the 21st.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I really appreciate the sort of both and, I think, approach that good scholarship, good family histories require and needs, that it's not only the archive, it's this sense of how this continues to play out, legacy, the legacies of this enslavement into the present in many ways as well. Both of you reflected briefly on the power and the role of multi-generational family lineages as well, in terms of these histories of enslavement, these histories of finding belonging, of making connections, of escaping slavery. And I just wondered if you could reflect, each of you, a little bit, maybe on the importance to you and your research and your families, in Egypt's case, in terms of reconstruction of these lineages, both archivally and research-wise, and the difficulty of that, I think, in a way, but also why that's so powerful and why it's important to think about people and their connections and the meaning-making that they kind of are able to do over time, especially given the dislocation and severing of these ties that is one of the legacies of slavery as well. So,
That's a great question. And that is one of the main reasons why the Slave Legacy History Coalition was found. And we're making a platform for all of you to learn the pieces that are missing. You know, there's different, a wealth of information out there that needs to be shared with the general public. You know, people that are out there searching for their history or don't even know that some of their history is lost. To be able to have archive at one location from different walks of life come together will help and maybe be an easier access for people who are on that journey to learn more about their history. And I will say that in my process, my personal take, in meeting Julia Royal, you know, I would have never thought that I would grow an extended family from someone that enslaved my family. So in the process of your journey in legacy, there's more life that can be found in the process.
Well, I don't have a connection to the stories I'm telling. I really came to these subjects by accident because I found some documents and writing my first book that related to Massachusetts Bay's auctioning of captives from King Philip's War, some of whom were sent to Tangier, some who ended up in the Azores, Barbados. And I hadn't known about that, and I was a professional historian teaching undergraduates, and I felt like, this is terrible. I'm not teaching accurate history. So for me, it has been, a deep dive into, a new area of research. I'm, aware that I think, being a descendant communities have a particular authority, and one of the things I had meant to talk about was also what still is, what is free soil then when you have all these pass laws and fugitive slave acts and so on. It still remains, free soil for many of these people who run away remains the reserves, even the reserves that the English create in the 18th century, 17th and 18th century, that have been the foundation for the creation of federally recognized tribal nations in the 1970s, 1980s, and moving forward into the 21st century, that these reserves just remained a refuge for people, and bridged the 19th to the 20th century to the present with federal recognition. Like, if it wasn't for the activities of these, of often women, people who maintained connection to land, maintained culture through slavery, through detribalization, through getting kicked off their land, through everything you can possibly imagine. And yet here we are in the 21st century, and these communities are a force in the region and the country. So I think that is an inspirational ancestor story, even as they remain, beleaguered by lawsuits and policy and other sorts of difficulties. So.
Thanks for those responses. Maybe to riff off of that for a minute in terms of New England and the kinds of stories that you didn't know as a professor, teaching a class. What about New Englanders today who are here, in Boston, around New England, going to the beach, going to the mountains? There's not a whole lot of evidence or visible reminders of this history, right? So just to play the skeptic for a moment, what would you say to someone who was like, well, it was just a small percentage of people and it only lasted for a short period of time, and slavery wasn't really a big part of New England's legacy and this history? How would you sort of want people to think more robustly about the role and the central role that slavery played, even in a place like New England, which today sort of has distanced itself from that history?
Well, when we think about the New England era, we think abolitionists, Southern enslavers. There was no enslavement here. That's not so clean cut. That's a door of opportunity to educate. I'm very active when it comes to educating people that don't know. We're constantly educating each other. Slavery is American history, and unfortunately, yes, in the North, there was slavery. So it opens the door for communication, for people to learn the history that they was unaware of. And as I'm looking now around this audience, there's a rainbow of people in this audience, but we're here together learning tonight. And so I would say when you come across the unknown, give a little bit grace and know that as we are sitting here together at all different walks of life, we can come together and learn this, hard, harsh history.
I cannot add anything to that wonderful answer. So I'll throw it back to Lynn or to the audience.
So I want to ask one more question, then we will turn to the audience. One of the things that might have stuck out to people who are here or online is thinking about sort of the two kinds of histories of slavery that are being narrated here. And it wasn't said specifically and explicitly, but I think there's a way in which, like, the story we know of slavery in the United States is mostly one of African and African-descended slavery, right? And I think that the new stories that are being told through the archive, through sometimes even community histories and oral histories of Native nations today and communities today, is one of a recognition of this other slavery, as one scholar has called it, of indigenous slavery. And so I wondered if the two of you might just reflect on how people online and here might try to think about those two slaveries coexisting and what kind of new narratives we might tell as a result. I think there's a whole lot of Americans who don't know much about indigenous history, and maybe not African history as well, and slavery history, but I think that it's more known through a long process of educating, as you were just saying, too. So maybe just reflect on not even just African versus indigenous slavery, but also the way in which race and racial differentiation was kind of formed. And that's a big topic and loaded question, but just trying to think about how we might consider these histories as intertwining and related rather than completely separate.
Well, both of them are very important. And that's why I really do appreciate Margaret's work, in her studies. It should be commended. Neither one is more important than the other. I think that's the equal playing field. It needs to be heard, needs to be learned and understood. And probably with so many other different generations too as well. But I will let Margaret help me with that question, because she's doing wonderful work with Indigenous people, and I do believe that that is not highlighted enough. And so I do commend her on that.
Thank you. Well, I think the two stories are connected in important ways in New England and elsewhere. So I mentioned this very slim body of law in New England on slavery and the failure to establish its heritability. So this had impacts on the enslaved African community as that community grew in size and became the majority population of enslaved people in the 18th century, because the law stayed the same as it had been developed around Native Americans. And as often there was a push behind the scenes to make slavery inheritable, and this often came up with these freedom suits that I ended with these people who challenged their enslavement. And the legislators were like, well, but they didn't want to make it inheritable, they didn't want that to affect Native Americans, but if they didn't, then they knew it was affecting the way Africans were being held in slavery, and the legal ability of people to claim that the children of their African slaves remained in doubt. I mean, they absolutely know that these two things are connected, and they kind of don't want to go all in and specify and go all Barbados, because then it's going to affect these indigenous servants that they had created almost a separate system for. So I think there's that. And I don't want to say that, slavery varied across region too, and I think New England's different because Native Americans were the charter generation. So enslaved people retained the right to testify in court. They retained the right to marry. Now, you had to have your master's permission, but I mean, marriage is so much the opposite of what slavery is. And enslaved people were not allowed to marry in most of these other colonial societies. So, they could challenge they could bring freedom suits, and they were not permitted to do so in other places. So that and part of it is, I think, because of the large presence of the free indigenous community that remained an important part of New England society. So that the presence of Native Americans and their enslavement affected the experience of enslaved Africans. And then these communities intermarried. The Native American reserves were were free soil for African Americans too. So many of them move and migrate to the edges of these reserves. They find community there. They find partners both within households and in the reserves. And so you end up with a multiracial, multi-ethnic population. In some ways, these indigenous communities of New England were the most modern communities of their moment. They were ethnically very diverse. People were engaged in industrial activity like whaling and so on. I mean, it was very difficult to absorb these people of different ethnicities but they did it. And you see these things held up federal recognition. The racial composition of New England indigenous communities was actually held against them when it came time to apply for recognition, federal recognition. They were viewed as too black, too African American in appearance, right? So that's a kind of legacy as well.
Thanks to you both. And so we do want to turn to the audience first in the room and then eventually to folks online as well who are grateful and have joined us too. So we have some mic runners. If you'd raise your hands and wait for a mic to come to you, that would be really helpful. And maybe if you could identify yourself as well, just so we know who we're hearing from. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mary. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And it makes me start thinking with me, my husband being African American, we just started with just the Ancestry, .com, and discovered that his great-grandfather had been enslaved, and in his mother's maiden name was one that his great-grandfather had taken on from his enslaver. So from there, and then, through my ancestry, I discovered that, my mother's comes from the Politaca Nation in Texas, and we're both native Texans. So from there, where do you go to research even more and get deeper into the family roots?
Well, I will say that first, if you have any older or elder living descendants right now, please pick their brain before it is too late. Start there. Your family is the number one contact with a wealth of information if you are able to do that. Secondly, I will highly suggest the National Archives. I would be more cautious about the heritage and the things that are online, because the majority of that is inputted by, some family members, some random people that enter things off with the top of their mind without being verified. So some of the data is incorrect. A lot of universities, the African American history professors go to the local universities, have a wealth of information, and they have researchers there that have been researching this very accurately. So I would definitely start with the National Archives and go to local universities. But then again, I cannot stress, once your family members are gone, they're gone. And then you'll have to start digging up your research through documents that you hope that they have found and properly labeled for you to be able to document. So that's why my recommendation would be.
Thank you for the presentation we have just had. They were very informative, educational. My name is Alan Knight, and my question is, we hear so much going on about the Civil War and the African American making their way through the Underground Railroad. But is there any connection, a century later, but coming up with the indigenous people in New England, in Boston in particular, already going through a process of this integrating or trying to being pushed aside? What was the relationship to the African Americans coming a century later into the New England area, though, since the Underground Railroad more or less already sort of established?
That's a good question. Many of the African Americans who came north on the Underground Railroad ended up in cities. So there is an effort to put some of them. So there were often these anti-slavery societies that were kind of would receive people, find them homes, and try to get them jobs and things like that, particularly for the men. And so there's the conductor in Boston, or not conductor, the person who was in this kind of aid society. He was always trying to get people to send people to Worcester or move them to some of the other towns, right? So I think in the urban environment of Boston by the mid-19th century, there just wasn't as large a Native American population as there had been I think though in Newport, Providence, some of the towns on the Rhode Island Newport border, was probably more interaction with indigenous communities. There were still African Americans and Native Americans living in rural areas of New England, of Long Island, North Fork of Long Island, farmers, people who own land and so on. So, you ask a really good question, and I'll have to look into it.
I have a request of Margaret. My name is Sarah. I'm with the Partnership of Historic Bostons, and thank you all. It was a brilliant presentation. So I just wanted to ask you if you could pick up again on the freedom suits that you mentioned and the way in which they might have disrupted popular understanding of slavery being an acceptable part of society. Did they?
Well, the first suit was all of the people claimed some indigenous as well as African ancestry, and in some cases the case really turned on that indigenous ancestry, and in another case, in the end, it didn't as much. So the first case was a man named Abda, and in 1704, his slaveholder Thomas Richards demanded he be arrested. He had absented himself. He had run away. And he was put in jail. And Abda, any of you, when you were little, ever had your parents threaten to read you the Riot Act? Or has anyone who has heard the term hue and cry? All right, this is sort of a New English. It is a fine New England tradition. But I mean, this is this is a English common law thing. This was how you called out the neighborhood to act as a police force. You set up a hue and cry, to deal with some threat to the community. So it is like a legal term for mobilizing a posse. Posse is Latin. It literally is what you did with hue and cry. Well, Abda set up the hue and cry, not Thomas Richards. And the community broke Abda out of jail. And then Richards sort of sues Abda, and a local jury says, we're going to free Abda. So he claimed illegal enslavement. He claimed his mother shouldn't have been enslaved. She was one of these captives that should have been a pro tempore, a term with a long term, but a term as a war captive. But she had been held in slavery. So he was a grandchild of this woman. He said, my mother, she was free when she had my mother, so I'm free. And the jury agreed with him. So it's like a very early jury case where the jury actually agrees. And Richards appeals all the way up to the state legislature. And the state legislature debates doing something about the law, decides not to, but basically, says, okay, you have to go back to Richards. And Richards writes that I cannot get him back. No one will help me get him back. So basically, the community has decided that they are not going to police this man's enslavement. So that to me is a significant act. The other two, so we were talking about ancestry. I also think we need to talk about what people historians call fictional kinship, fictive kinship. So kin ties are one way that you become a successful freedom seeker. You go to family. But people create relatives along the way. The process of fleeing, and this is true in the 19th century Underground Railroad, is you sometimes are coming with family, but you meet people along the way that become your new family. And people often take the same surnames and things like that with people that they met along the way as they create new names and new identities. So people are creating relationships. They might be with people of the same ethnicity, they might be across racial and ethnic lines, and escaping with them, escaping in groups, doing all these things. And they're passing information. Communities are telling people, okay, this person made it to freedom. Here's an idea of how to do it. So Sarah Chalkwam, in a generation after Abda, she is a servant, but a free person in age-appropriate servitude, biracial, in a Rhode Island household, and she's trafficked to Connecticut. She sold 3 times, and the 3rd time she sold as a slave for life, in perpetuity. And she probably doesn't know. When she's 21 and she's not freed, as she should have been if she was a servant, she runs away. She realizes what's happened. She ran away, and she went back to Narragansett. So her slaveholder pursued her, and when he and basically got a writ to arrest her. But when it went to a local court, she started this series of litigation. And when she established that her mother had actually been from was Narragansett and had associations with one of the Narragansett reserves, the local authorities, freed her basically. And this is litigated for years. This case is litigated for like 9 years, off and on. And then Sarah comes back at this enslaver and sues him for reparations, and the Rhode Island courts give her that too. And these cases go all the way up to the Rhode Island legislature. Slaveholders are adjudicating these things, and they are siding with her. So, and then in the same household, about 10 years later, a man named Caesar makes a freedom case. He also wins his freedom. Juries agree with him. Appeal. State colonial legislature, oh my gosh, what are we going to do here? We're going to kick it. We're going to not make a decision, really. And he sues for reparations. And I'm sure it's because he knew Sarah Chalkham's case. And he wins reparations, too. So, the slaveholders are involved in a lot of these decisions. And these people clearly have a lot of community support. So I think you're seeing people that are embedded in their communities. Those communities have decided these people are not enslavable. The legislatures are under pressure, and a generation of lawyers and people who are thinking about these issues are starting to feel that Native Americans are not enslavable, that they are born native to New England, they're not enslavable, and this is going to help inform the first anti-slavery societies.
Hello, thank you, Margaret and Egypt, for a very powerful presentation. I'm Kim. I work in the violence prevention field here in Boston, and I'm constantly thinking about the connections between intergenerational trauma and how the legacies of colonization and slavery are still impacting us today. And I know, Margaret, you mentioned how slavery has morphed itself and is now, when we think about mass incarceration, it's still very much present today. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how you think we can better connect this historical legacy to contemporary issues of exploitation and inequality, and I think particularly how you see the role of historical scholarship in informing actions that we have to take today to address these ongoing systems of oppression. I know very often the work that I do with folks on the ground doing direct service work feel very disconnected from higher education, from coming to talks like this as well, but I'm often thinking about how do we connect history and our knowledge to direct action that can support people today. Thank you.
I think that's a great question. Thank you for that. It's very important to educate the community, especially in the schools. It's very important to start at home. If you're a parent, it's our responsibility to educate our children. But education is key. I think that the setback is probably fear, the fear of the unknown, fear of conversations. This is not an easy topic at all. There's no question that slavery has set back African Americans and indigenous people. There's no question on that. It's very difficult to go back even to the question to the young lady here and a question about researching your history, as researching it, slaves carried their master's last name, Darby Vassal. Vassal, it wasn't his name that he was born. We're lucky to find that his connection was in Ghana, Africa. So you have to kind of peel that layer off to really get to the root of what was your real last name, where country were you from, your ancestors. So the more we can come together and educate each other, and to give each other grace and understanding and patience, because this is not an easy process. It's very deep, and it's not going to be changed overnight. But with the slow pace, momentum, constantly moving, us coming together and educating each other, it would be very helpful to start, doing the change, that groundwork that you're doing, and I commend you for doing that as well.
Thank you.
So I want to thank everyone for the questions. I think we're out of time, and I apologize to the online folks for not getting to them. I really do. But hopefully we can continue the conversation very briefly before they kick us out. Before we thank our presenters, I just want to remind you that we have two, and if there could be, if we could forward the slide if you have a chance to. We have two more presentations, events in this series coming up, November 18th with Max Scott, who's a Narragansett and a historian at Brown, a good colleague of mine, on allegiance and sovereignty in the Dawnland. And then December 4th, historian Cherno Sese Jr. on the fight of Boston's Black Masons, more than a century after Puritans legalized slavery, as we heard today, to secure their freedom through a project called Petition After Petition. So, but join me in thanking Egypt and Margaret and for a great evening together. And thank you all. The meeting is adjourned, and feel free to come and say hello before we get moved on. Thanks so much.